Howdy folks, Deacon Parsons here. This is part 3 of my advice to modern men, where I'm going to tell you the stories of the last 2 of the 6 men who were huge influences on my life and manhood. The 5th man on this list is Russell, Grandpa George's best friend. He was such a close friend that my mother was the flower girl at Russell's wedding. Russell's son was a ring bearer at my parents' wedding. My brother was a ring bearer at Russell's son's wedding. I knew Russell all my life. Of my World War II age mentors, he was the last to pass away, so I knew him the longest. He was the only one of them to see me into my teens, high school, marry, and become a father. He didn't butt in, but was always there if I needed his advice, and it was always the straight, unsugar-coated truth delivered in love. The advice and guidance of a man of his caliber was invaluable to me. Russell was a private in the Army with 1 year of college when Pearl Harbor was attacked. They 90-day wandered him and sent him as a second lieutenant to the Pacific for the duration. By VJ Day, he was a bird colonel. He retired from the Army Reserves with a permanent rank of major. I had asked him to tell me about the war my whole life. One day in the 1970s, he finally told me one story. Near the end of the war, he was in command of a refueling airstrip just about as big as the island it was on. They had no planes of their own. They just refueled and rearmed planes on their way to and from targets. The Japanese came to attack the island. He called in planes to help with the attack as he sent his ground forces into the meat grinder. As the planes came in, they would bomb and strafe the end of the airstrip that the Japs held, land, rearm, refuel, then take off and attack again. Fighting was so desperate that he was bombing his own airstrip. It was a simple bonsai attack. No quarter asked or given. There was nowhere to retreat, no way to leave the island, and the island was strategic, so it needed to be held. So he held. Absorbing massive casualties, they pushed the Japanese back and killed them. All of them. To the last man. As he told me this, I watched in quiet horror as Russell's face changed. A man I knew to be as strong as tempered steel was brought to tears by the memories of some 30 years after the fact. There are no words to describe his countenance. The face of someone experiencing hell sounds too shallow and too trite to do it justice. I'd always been taught to honor combat veterans, but on that day it quit being an intellectual exercise and became a part of me. The strength and sacrifice that it took to bear such a burden is beyond civilian comprehension. Russell lived a good life and was a good man, but his war experience saddled him with a hatred of Japan that to my knowledge he was never able to shake. Nothing made in Japan was allowed in his house. He was a man of faith and struggled to overcome his hate, but I believe it resided with him until his death. Russell was an honest, humble, sincere, hard-working man's man, and I am fortunate to have known him and proud to have had him as a role model and advisor. The bard was right. I am accursed and hold my manhood cheap, while any speak that fought upon St. Crispin's Day. Now we're going to take a bit of a tangent here and discuss combat veterans in general. As I said, 2 of the men who greatly influenced my life were combat vets. Their examples of their lives after the war were significant to my life. But I don't want to be misunderstood and have people think that real men don't need help dealing with combat. I wasn't alive when these 2 men came home, so I didn't actually see what they and their families went through. I only saw them years later after they had worked through their issues. It is sometimes said that the World War II veterans were in some way stronger or more able to cope with what they went through than combat veterans of later wars. This is not true. Every combat veteran needs help dealing with their experiences. Combat demands that decent people do indecent things. Unless they are of the small percentage of sociopaths and psychopaths, every combat veteran will find it difficult to reconcile what they did in combat with their core morality. And in 99% of the cases, it will take another combat vet to help them. World War II veterans did have 3 advantages going for them that combat veterans since have not had. Number 1, after Pearl Harbor, the anti-war movement for all intents and purposes ceased to exist. World War II is the only time that the entire country was united in support of a war. Number 2, after the war was over, they spent weeks in camps waiting to get on ships and spent weeks sailing home. They had nothing to do in those weeks other than talk to their combat buddies about going home. We are just now beginning to realize how much of a difference this ersatz group therapy made in soldiers' lives and ability to deal with their experiences. Number 3, there were millions of them at home. It was relatively easy for a vet to go down to the VFW hall and find someone to talk to who could understand what he was going through. Most people don't realize that the Veterans of Foreign Wars was founded in no small part to give support to combat vets and their spouses after they came home. A majority of the VFW posts that exist today were founded by World War II vets. There are many combat veterans in our society today. They don't have the support of society at large that our World War II veterans came back home to. They deserve better. If you have a friend or a relative that is a combat vet and appears to be having problems, remember that it will usually take a combat vet to help a combat vet. Part of what lets them carry their burdens is the fact that they went to war so you and I didn't have to. They stood between evil and us. Sharing their wartime experience with non-combatants removes some of their coping tools. If you want to help them, let them know you understand and accept that they can't talk to you about it. That you understand they're trying to protect you. Encourage them to reach out to one of their buddies, to the VA, to the local VFW. If you have to, you may have to quietly reach out to one of those groups to bring help in. We send decent people into the incredible indecency of war. We owe it to them to do everything we can to provide what they need to come back to civilian life. Okay, with that disclaimer out of the way, back to my story. These first 5 men made huge impacts on my life. They may not be heroes to anyone else, but they are heroes to me. Collectively, they defeated a deadly disease and physical handicaps, defeated the Dust Bowl, defeated the Depression, defeated Imperial Japan, and defeated the Nazis. They fought their fights, bore their scars, persevered, overcame, and succeeded in their own individual ways. The last person on my list didn't. He wasn't a hero, but a failure. He never grew up and overcame anything. He was my father. The pivotal occurrence of Dad's life was contracting polio in the 1940s. Polio is a horrible, debilitating disease. Treatment in the 1940s was extremely painful. The disease settled in one of his legs. They had to put pins in the other leg to keep it from growing. Doctors told Grandma and Grandpa that Dad would never walk again. Grandma told them to go to hell and forced Dad to stand up against the wall until he built up enough strength to stand and walk. He always walked with a limp, but he walked. What he never did get over was self-pity, childish selfishness, and attempts to medicate away any kind of pain. Dad was a mean drunk. He said he was glad that other drugs weren't available when he was in college because he would have been all over them too. For whatever reason, whether it was his temperament or if his parents somehow failed to teach him the lesson, Dad never actually crossed the threshold and became a man. He couldn't see the good things he had, only what he wanted but didn't have. He never accepted the misfortunes of life and built on the good things that he had. And he had a lot of good things. He had some of the best luck around. He couldn't see how fortunate he was to be able to walk without crutches. All he could see was that he wasn't able to play sports the way he wanted to. Because of his polio, Grandma and Grandpa sent him to college and made sure he got a 4-year degree. When he graduated, they set him up with a five-and-dime store in town. He got married and I came along. He didn't like being a storekeeper and started spending most of the day in the pool hall drinking beer. He sold the store to Uncle Tuck, and Grandpa bought the south place for us to move to. With the advances of machines, tools, and Grandpa's smarts, Dad was able to be a reasonably successful farmer, and by all accounts the drinking slowed down. However, shortly after we moved to the home place, my second sister was born. She was extremely brain damaged. The technical term at the time was retarded. In the 1960s, things were much different than they are today. Such things weren't all that well understood, and there was a stigma attached to having such a child. It drove a wedge between Mom and Dad lost it. He started coming home drunk more often than not. As I said, he was a mean drunk, more emotionally abusive than physically, but he got physical too. His parents did their best to intervene, but to no avail. After a particularly bad argument with Grandpa, Dad packed us up and we moved to town. Mom and Dad broke up a couple of times. Dad went to treatment a couple of times, but it never took. Eventually it became clear that Dad just wasn't going to quit drinking, and they divorced for good. Now, unlike some children in abusive home situations, I was lucky. I was aware that Dad's behavior was not acceptable or to be emulated. I had enough other positive male role models in my life who came right out and said clearly that what Dad was doing was wrong. In early grade school, I began to consciously reject lessons I was learning from Dad. And Dad was aware that he was a bad example. I don't know how many times he told me to do as he said, not as he did. Now, I'm sure it doesn't take much thought to realize that being held to a standard by your father that he won't hold himself to is a bit of a problem. Our relationship was never good. Basically, raising myself was an extremely painful process. I floundered around considerably. The fact that the divorce happened in the early 1970s and Mom moved us to college for a couple of years so she could get her degree to find a job, and that pulled me away from my mentors, didn't help. The cultural upheaval of the 1970s helped even less. Most of my junior high and high school years were years of making poor decisions. With my background, saying no to drugs wasn't difficult, but there were other activities in the 1970s that weren't as benign as we were told. That whole sexual revolution thing, well, it was a failure. And it still is, for that matter. By my senior year in high school, I'd put most of those issues behind me, found a good path, a good woman, got married, and started a family. Dad and I still locked horns a lot. Once, when I was being particularly harsh with him, he asked me why I expected him to live up to such high standards. I asked him to point out one standard that I was holding him to that he hadn't held me to. Just one. He couldn't. Dad and I finally came to a fairly calm truce. I had made myself into a reasonably good man despite him, which he eventually acknowledged. I was able to let go of the hatred of him choosing a bottle of beer over me. We didn't see much of each other through the years. When he was on his deathbed, he finally saw what he had done with his life. He said, my dad would be so ashamed of me. And he was right. I had to wait until he was in his 70s and dying, but I finally got to see my dad grow up just a day or so before he died. It was a very poignant moment, and even if it's very cliche, death waits for all of us. Don't live a life you'll be ashamed of when death comes for you. Don't look back with regret. Now, my dad had some very good qualities and was very talented in many ways. He could have easily been quite successful in every area of his life, but he never manned up. He never took charge of his life. He lived his whole life as a victim. Instead of accepting that life isn't fair, he pouted. He drank and gambled away his legacy and mine. The most valuable thing my father left me was a bad example. The problem with that is there are many ways to do something wrong and only a few or one way to do it right. Okay, those are the 6 men that were major influences in my life. To kind of wrap all these things up, what are the things I decided are worth dying for? Family is worth dying for. My country is worth dying for. My faith is worth dying for. In general, I believe in few rules, clear lines, and rigorous enforcement. All of these things can be distilled down into one 5-word phrase, one omnibus principle that covers everything. It also encompasses my political outlook and philosophy. Liberty and justice for all. The last 5 words of the Pledge of Allegiance in the United States. In everything, I take the side of liberty and justice for all. Well, there you have it. I hope you found this useful or at least entertaining. If you're so inclined, please like, share, and subscribe. This is Deacon Parsons saying, love your maker, love your mate, and do what's right because it's right, and devil take the hindmost.